Hello, good
Hi
evening.
guys, what's up? This is
How we
Jayavardhan.
doing, Jay?
Very good, very good. Calcutta has great weather.
How's the weather there today?
Nice only. I mean, it's a bit humid, but I'm pretty sure it's certainly warmer than Delhi.
Yeah, Delhi weather is very confusing. Sometimes it's very cold, sometimes
Yeah,
it's weirdly hot. So
yes.
Delhi is being Delhi. So last time we spoke about Eastern Europe, the politics, the conflict, the ethnicities, and failures of many international organizations while dealing with Eastern Europe. So today let's take a deep dive into the history of the region,
hmm
the politics of the region. And my sense is that you cannot really divorce the history of Eastern Europe from the history of the Soviet Union and Russia. To a large extent, it is
Modern
one and the
history,
same
yes.
thing.
Yeah,
Yes, modern history, I would say from the late 1800s to 2022
yeah.
and to the present day. So it's deeply interlinked. So, Jay, what are your thoughts on that?
It is deeply interlinked given that the political scenario of the last Tsarist empire was so fragile that it forced most of the peasantry to take up arms against the theocratic society of Russia. And eventually that led to the Red Revolution, which was led by the legendary Vladimir Lenin, who belonged to the Ulyanov clan. Vladimir Lenin's brother was actually put to the shackles and later executed because he had participated in the attempted assassination of the Tsar. So
Yeah,
there was some personal grudges against the Tsarist rule of Russia around that
uh,
time.
a lot of passionate political movements have very often some deep personal drivers as well. The
Absolutely.
the ideas of, Marxism and the writing of Das Kapital, whatever, sorry for my pronunciation, the Communist Manifesto, and the further contextualizing of these texts by Lenin into the agrarian Russian society to make it more relatable to the Russian society. Those became very popular ideas in, I suppose, the late 1910s, driving up to the February Revolution, I believe, which happened in
Yes.
February 1917, when the larger general public of sorry, forgive me, the then Russia was very discontent with the leadership of the Tsar too, and there was
Nicholas.
yes, there was very poor social infrastructure. People were hungry. Agrarian output was very poor. Standard imperial ignorance and the person on the ground suffering. So, by and large, you can attribute these revolutionary ideas, developments to a poor social infrastructure, I suppose.
Before we
Marxism, Leninism,
yeah,
sorry, sorry to interrupt
yeah, yeah.
you.
Nee, go ahead, go ahead, go
Continue.
ahead.
So Marxism, Leninism, and their Soviet-style Marxism with these revolutionary ideas would not have developed had the Tsars not been totally apathetic to the delivery of public services to the man on the ground or to the woman on the ground. So that is my raw wisdom. People are free to disagree because I don't think
Yeah,
there's any way to test this
yeah.
hypothesis. But
Last time we discussed that it's from the Kievan Rus that eventually you had the genesis of the Russian state that we see today. Moscow as a city was only settled probably in the 12th century, 12th or the 13th century, and after that, through Moscow, you had the creation of the modern Russian state, which was independent of modern day Ukraine, which had its own autonomous principalities, as we had discussed, which were mostly fighting amongst each other or were under the Polish suzerainty. The reason why the Russian state expanded eastwards is because there were a lot of Turkic slash Tatar raids that used to happen in their territories. So these Turkic tribes, who were generally heavily influenced by the Mongols, they used to come in Russian Slavic territories. They used to lay siege to their cities, and they used to destroy a lot of their crops, a lot of their livestock, and their economy because of constant warfare. In order to subdue these warlike tribes, the Russian state eventually started moving eastwards, and first it captured what today we known as Tatarstan, which is another province in Russia, an oblast, if you may. From Tatarstan, after subjugating the Turkic people of Tatarstan, the capital of Tatarstan is Kazan. They went eastwards, and eventually capturing all of Siberian hinterland, and they reached all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It is said that they had captured most of Eastern Europe before they had actually captured Kiev. So
Right.
that is one point that a lot of Ukrainian historians also raise. Now, before we
And which
jump
period
into
is this happening in?
this is happening from the 12th, 13th century all the way till the 17th century. So it was a long drawn
Okay.
process. So we have to take into account the 400, 500 years that this expansion took place in for the Tsarist Russia. So before we start the conversation of the Soviet Union, we must acknowledge that Soviet Union, once it started its journey into mainstream political domination of the world, they played the anti-colonial card a lot. But we're forgetting that the Russian Empire, in its heyday, was
I think
also
anti-imperial would
extremely
be a better word.
no, but they also brandished themselves as being anti-colonial. They did,
Okay.
and their main opponents were the British Raj. Their main opponents were all the again Anglo-Saxon dominated territories of the Americas. So they tried to brandish themselves as the saviors of these people who were subjugated by so-called their enemy in the times of domination. Now, coming back to the first point that I was trying to make, so there was the Soviet foreign minister called, forgive me, I'm forgetting his name, Alexander Gorchakov. He was a Tsarist foreign minister, and he
So
basically
Russian Tsarist foreign
yeah,
minister.
foreign minister, and he was a prince, and he was one
Hmm.
of the architects of Russian imperial expansion. And
Right.
he very clearly said that Russia's eastward expansion was very similar to that of the mission Civilisatris, which the European powers indulged in their new colonies. Now I'm quoting him. He said that the position of Russia in Central Asia, and by implication in other areas subjugated by the Tsars, is that of all civilized states which are brought in contact with half savage nomad populations possessing no fixed social organization. So uh, before we jump into how Soviet Union came to its existence, we have to understand the colonial undertones in the Tsarist regime, which were later taken over by the Soviet Union itself. So once
So these
the
undertones were about people from other regions in the Soviet Union,
yes,
like Tajikistan or
yes,
Uzbekistan,
yes,
Moldova, etc.
yes,
There were about, I don't know, 15 odd
mhm,
countries now that
yes,
exist today, which were part of the erstwhile Soviet
erstwhile
Union.
Soviet Union.
And the
And
Russian Tsarists had a negative view about the indigenous populations of those areas. Is that what you're
yes,
saying?
yeah, in essentiality, what they were doing was they were trying to put the Russians also with the mainstream white population of Western Europe, because Western Europe around that time was also indulging in its colonial maneuvers, like the Americans were having their firm grip over Western North America, which was known as Manifest Destiny, where the Russians, sorry, the Americans started inhabiting lands which were belonging to the Mexicans and the natives, and completely destroying their local cultures and subjugating them. So with the Americans, we saw it in the Manifest Destiny, and with the British, we saw it in the British Raj and the innumerable colonies that they held all across the world.
Mhm.
So the Russians here are trying to say that they also have their version of Manifest Destiny, where or colonization, where they're going westwards and they're quote unquote trying to civilize these populations, and they used
Mhm.
brute force. A lot of Russian historians have agreed to. The fact that it was only through brute force that Russians were able to control such a huge territory. In fact,
Right.
Vladimir Lenin later on went on to say that if you scratch off the communist from a Russian, you will see a Russian chauvinist in that communist Russian also, who would talk about retaking Constantinople, who would talk about getting some port areas in warm Indian Oceans, or who would also reap the benefits of Azerbaijani oil coming in so that their tanks can run, or would use the Central Asian cotton, Uzbeki cotton, so that their uniforms
Yeah,
can be made.
any institution that holds power has this colonial undertone, colonial sentiment that was always alive and kicking.
Yes,
And I would argue that it still exists today in many
yes,
institutions and organizations
absolutely.
across the world. So powers might come and go, but the colonial sentiment is usually always alive and
The
kicking.
same. Yes,
So we have a situation in the late 19th century, early 20th century, where people are by and large dissatisfied with the administration of the czars. Revolutionary ideas like the Communist Manifesto and the Das Kapital are picking up. Lenin is contextualizing these works into the agrarian Russian society. The time is ripe for a revolution which does happen. 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution happens. The so-called communists take over administration and rule of Russia. And in 1922, the Soviet Union is established. Now, a united, strong nation which claims to have large amounts of state production, centralized planning, and a huge geographical expanse built on such a strong ideological movement dies down in 69 years. Less than 70 years is the lifespan of this nation that we are talking about. So let's start establishing what all exactly went wrong. What are the flaws and the fault lines in the ideology? What leaders could have done differently? The kind of elitism that creeps in the Communist Party members themselves. Like, for example, the Soviets used to have a Congress of Soviets to show a garb of legislative representation, but we know it was largely dominated by
the Russians.
Communist Party members themselves.
Yeah,
So let's start establishing by what went wrong. 69 years is a very small amount of time for a country to exist. Like, I know many people who are more than 69 years old and they're all in a
yeah,
very good condition. So, it's that
yeah,
young.
yeah, yeah. In fact,
So,
we still know so many people in India who still refer to Russia as Soviet Union. Like they don't call
USSR,
it Russia; they just still
yeah.
call it USSR.
And because of historical linkages, we
Yeah,
happen to know several people who went and studied there and
studied
learned
there.
there and then
Yeah,
joined government service in
mhm.
India. So, they all lived in Moscow and Leningrad
Yeah.
and Stalingrad. These were still cities and all that.
My wife's grandfather went to East Germany, like during the
Yeah.
times of communist domination.
Mhm. So let's
Hmm.
now describe what exactly went wrong. Do you have your thoughts ready on that?
Yeah, what went wrong was, again, as I mentioned first, and we had discussed this in the last episode as well. You can check it out. What went wrong was that for a lot of people who suddenly came under the Soviet rule, they thought that this is just Russians dominating over us under a different ideology. They did not see eye to eye with the Russians with respect to the theological identity that they were carrying, which was the Eastern
Sorry
Orthodox
to
Church.
interrupt you.
Yeah,
Sorry to interrupt
yeah.
you. To make this clear, they
Yeah.
here is Georgians, Ukrainians,
Georgians,
Belarusians, all the
Ukrainians,
other,
Belarusians,
all
all the
other
people which
Soviets.
the yeah, all other peoples who were subjugated by the Tsarist Russians.
Okay,
So they
right.
just
Go
thought
on.
that this is just another ideology that the Russians are carrying, and they're again imposing it on us. Before that, it was the Eastern Orthodox Church, which was heavily bureaucratized. Now it was communism, and now it was worse to accept because the communists called themselves atheists. So all types of religious practices, all types of cultural practices, all types of theocratic understanding of philosophy were totally done away with at the behest or at the cost of a lot of regional identities. Also, the fact that during the time of Stalin, there was a massive pushback against the people who the Russian state branded as collaborators. The entire Chechen state was depopulated and sent to Siberia. There was a massive crackdown against anyone who spoke against Stalin or the Communist Party. So Soviet Union was created on such a fissured ground that its eventual collapse was written the moment it started.
This is very interesting. Your last line is very interesting to what you said, to what I am about to add to this. Just
Yeah,
before we started recording today, I was doing a little bit of research and I was reading an article by the Foundation for Economic Freedom, which we will
yeah,
link in the description of this
yeah. We
video.
will also link the paper
And
that I'm quoting today.
yes, we will
Yeah,
put out all our bibliographies and our
yeah,
research works for people who are interested in reading these issues
yeah,
further. So, because you said that the Soviet Union's last days were kind of written the day the country was
yeah,
formed. So,
yeah,
this article by the Foundation of Economic Freedom, Why Communism Failed, which I believe was published in the early 90s only. It's the archive is still there on the internet, mentions an economist who was not very famous at the time. He gained renown later. His name was Ludwig von Mises. He
yeah,
stated right after the Bolshevik Revolution. So if the Bolshevik Revolution happened in 1917, he made a statement at 1920 that communism is something that will not last. It is very likely to fail, and he gave some eerily accurate predictions about how the trajectory was going to be. He said
hmm,
things like abolishing the free market would largely lead to all kind of inefficiencies in planning and production. And it's a very sound economic principle. Anybody who studied basic 11th, 12th economics also knows that once the state control becomes excessive, resource allocation becomes a problem. And as a result of that, how do you plan the allocation of raw materials, factories, farm products when none of it is privately owned? When all of it is owned by the state, production efficiencies, these become very difficult. Now, I'm not totally delegitimizing the communist ideology, but these were the predictions that were made, and it held true largely because of empirical evidence. So, like you said, not just you, many economists, even in those times, had predicted communism as dead on arrival. It was, for the lack of a better description, totally dead on arrival.
yeah.
Yeah, that's
Absolutely. We
I
have states like the People's Republic of China, the Vietnamese Republic, who were all communist. But the moment they were able to privatize their markets, they're just doing fine right now.
yeah. I
And
think at the risk of being called, I don't use the word, at the risk of gaining some criticism from my own brethren in India, I have some amount of admiration for China, just a slight amount.
mm,
And you have to respect your adversaries also in that level
absolutely,
because they have privatized and industrialized and implemented some very sound economic principles, which is the reason behind the China success story. I would always love to see India at a strengthened position against China, but at some level we need to understand our adversaries' successes also. So this is why
yes,
China as a communist nation or as a self-identifying communist nation still survives. Anyway, continue.
absolutely. You know, the eerie part of this conversation is that the moment you were talking about China and you were praising China, you basically gave a thumbs up unintentionally, and it recorded on the Google Meets talk, and it came in as a pop up. We're gonna keep it in the main video. It's hilarious.
I didn't do that, bro.
I know you didn't do that, but it's quite funny.
I think it
It
was
just
the
automatically
people's
records it.
it
It
was
was
the
the people.
People's Liberation Army. It was the People's Liberation Army
Yeah.
intelligence giving me a thumbs up.
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And because there was no free market economy, and most of these uh, these Soviet institutions were dominated by the Russian elite, there was just a specific type of people which was reaping all the benefits. First, it wasn't that well established, but as the Russian economy started to suffer, specifically during late 80s, that's when you understood how much of an economic disparity there was between the Soviet elites and the masses. What had happened was that a lot of these Soviet bureaucrats, specifically the external officers, looked for postings outside in places like the United States of America or Western Europe. And once they used to come back to mainland, they used to come back with a lot of goods which were Western made, a lot of goods which were associated with the Western world, which was at envy of a lot of people in the Soviet Union, where they suddenly started feeling that just because they are not being able to establish themselves as a free market economy, this is what they're missing out on. And
Mhm.
that became a major reason for discontent. So now this takes me to the point of American soft power. American soft power actually played a very important role in the eventual disintegration of Soviet Union because you had American movies, you had American media, you had American literature, research, which was being accessed by the Soviet masses, and that also drove the idea of envy towards what West was
Yeah,
offering them.
people in the Soviet Union were getting ideas about democracy, about freedom to protest. They were
Yes,
getting ideas against single party rule. The idea that the average voter can go and pick your policy maker every general election is a very powerful thought. And that's a point that this West-led international order has driven home very successfully.
yes, yes, yes.
And that was one thing that probably worked against the existence of the
The Soviet
Soviet
Union.
Union. Like many other things, I think one of the simple principles that your average citizenry requires before getting into internal strife is that you do need to meet the aspirations of the general public. I think a big part of the present Indian success story also, and God willing, and by all best wishes, I hope it continues in India, is that the economy is growing very fast. The aspirations of the general public are being met largely. You know, the average person aspires roti, kapda, makan in simple terms, and the three principles that run a country, which is Samaj, Bazar, Sarkar. All these principles kind of
Can you
working in
translate
tandem.
that for the non-Hindi audience?
So non-Hindi audience, Samaj means society, Sarkar means government, and Bazaar means markets. So these principles need to work in coordination. I'm not going to take the credit for it. I picked it up from the from uh, a lot of course mates when I was at the Takshashila institution. So these things need to work in tandem to provide good public service outcomes, and that was lacking in the Soviet Union. Additional to that, you can't have any state that exists peacefully in times of economic stagnation. As
Yes.
Indians, we see that with our Western neighbor, not going to take any names. When there
Yeah.
is rot in agricultural production in a primarily agrarian society, when there is poor, inadequate housing, these things will frustrate the general public, and there will be stifle against that. Now you have a situation where your overall public service delivery system is awful, and then you are caught up in a space race and an arms race with the United States of America.
Exactly.
Now, my raw wisdom says also that the disadvantage any communist power would have had in a situation like that was in the US. At the time, the US government must have had the support of businesses, industrialists, big think tanks. So it was a whole of society approach from the US, and there was a kind of burden distribution as well, I would assume. And in the Soviet Union, the entire burden is also being taken up by the state itself. So there is no support from the industry in space race because the industry doesn't exist. There is no support from the academia in the space race and arms race because that doesn't exist. So this is the shortfall of having such a largely centralized planned economy. And that
Absolutely.
is a large reason of why Soviet Union was already dangling by a thread before Gorbachev's reforms. A lot of
Yes.
people
Yes.
have blamed that one single individual for the fall of the country, but I don't think that the economic principles were really successful to last another century or so.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah. I mean, most of Soviet exports were basically associated with the energy sector. So that led to, and that energy sector was extremely coal dominant. that led to a massive energy crisis in the erstwhile Soviet Union. And the only thing that could ensure that Soviet Union survives the whole of 70s and the 80s was once they discovered oil in Siberia. Once they discovered oil in Siberia, the discovery of oil in Siberia is what funded most of their invasion and their military campaign in Afghanistan. So, energy dependent economy, which was heavily dependent on coal, which did not modernize, which did not basically make itself dynamic with the incoming challenges, and was also putting most of the funding towards different sectors, is another reason why the Soviet economy fractured, and it can be associated with the eventual downfall.
Right. You mentioned the Afghanistan, the Soviet advent in Afghanistan, a
Yeah.
very, very unfortunate adventure for the Soviet Union.
Yes, the
Let's
death
talk
knell.
about, yeah, let's talk about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, 1979 to 1989, I believe, the
Yeah.
creation of the Mujahideen, the creation of certain individuals who played a very important role in the
Yeah.
21st century's global order, terrorism.
Yeah. You gotta give
So,
credit to the British Raj though. They had eventually they had already expected the Soviets slash Russians to enter Afghanistan at some point of time. And
mhm,
it is said that one of the reasons why they wanted to create a buffer state between Afghanistan and India was that if they create a Muslim dominated state as the buffer state, they would always have a lot of control over that area so that it could be like a choke point for the Russians. And that is exactly what
right.
happened in 1979. Before
Yeah,
1970, yeah.
I think to add to that, I don't know if this is rooted in historical fact or it's a conspiracy theory. Forgive me,
No,
I
it
can't
is.
comment
It
on
is
it.
not. It is
But
not rooted,
the,
but it is one of the understandings as to why Pakistan was made.
yeah, it's an assumption
It's
that,
an
the
assumption. It's an
mapping
assumption.
that was done,
Yes.
that many people say that
Yeah.
the lines were drawn randomly through,
Yes.
Gujarat and Sindh and
Yeah.
Rajasthan and those areas, and
Yeah.
Punjab was split into two. But
Yeah.
that buffer state was strategically created by the British to give a kind of gap between India and the Soviet Union.
Soviet Union.
And so by the time when the time came for independence, that Western map was already created. Now this is I have no way to historically prove this, and it's more of hearsay. So we'll let it be.
Yes.
I think I
We'll
watched
let
it
it
in
be.
some movie. So
Yeah.
at the movie,
No.
yeah.
But like
So
lot of hearsay happens from the Indian perspective as well. A lot of people
yeah.
who are quite big in the Indian bureaucracy agree to this notion that Pakistan was created in order to create a buffer zone between India and Soviet Union. So in
Guess
late
we'll
se-
never know.
we'll never know. We'll never know.
It's like Kanye West saying, "What happened if we didn't win? I guess we'll never
Guess we'll
know."
never know.
Anyway, please continue.
Anyway, so in the 70s, again, in the 70s, the Afghanistan monarchy was not even 1% of itself. And there was a lot of communist disturbance that was happening in Afghanistan. And in 1978, the Saur Revolution happened. And one communist entity took over. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name, so we'll be attaching the names in the description. And after that, the Soviet entity had taken over Afghanistan. The situation in Afghanistan became very, very fragile because, again, as what happens in Afghanistan, the central government in Afghanistan lost control of the countryside, which was dominated mostly by the Pashtun tribes, who were extremely conservative and were totally against the new social order that was being imposed on them by the communists. So their land-driven agrarian society was being taken away from them towards a more Soviet-based industrialized society. Now, the Soviet Union took extreme interest in that because if they would have controlled Afghanistan, then they would have had another closer outreach towards India, specifically from the Kashmiri side, and it would have been easier for for putting more pressure on Pakistan from both the sides, and also the fact that India and Soviet Union around that time had become like very close allies because of all the weapon treaties and space collaborations that the both countries indulged in. Coming back to the point, the conservative society of the countryside was totally against the communist revolution because it ensured that women had more rights, for the lack of a better word, and it basically regularized education. It went against the archaic land policies that were associated with tribalistic Pashtun practices, and it went away from the theological societies that these very proud tribes were living in for centuries, and they saw communism nothing but another foreign imperial imposition on them, just like a lot of other states who were not successful enough to resist the Soviet occupation. Now, once the Soviet invasion finally happened in 1979, Christmas Day, 25th December, if I'm not wrong. If I'm wrong, I'll correct it, put it in the description. In 1979, the Soviet invasion happened, and I think it was the Soviet army entered through Turkmenistan, Central Asia, and it was able to control most of the cities quite swiftly. But the Mujahideen was able to break the Soviet Union's back through its guerrilla attacks and hit and run tactics, which due to which the Soviet Union was never able to control the countryside, and it eventually led to the Soviet withdrawal in 1989 at the cost of 15,000 Soviet deaths, millions of Afghans dead, and a lot of bloodshed,
And no
which is
outcome, no
yeah
significant outcome from this
yeah no
entire
significant
campaign,
political outcome, no significant political
except
outcome.
maybe creation of like the Al Qaeda and radical
Yeah,
Islamic
and
terrorism.
the disintegration of Soviet Union, of course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there was significant losses incurred by the Soviet Union.
Hmm.
Afghanistan only fell into the rule of Taliban onwards
Yeah.
of that, continues to be,
Yes.
but creation of a lot of proxies and radical Islamist groups, which didn't help the world order and created many big anxieties in the 21st century. I'm
Hmm.
not attributing this totally to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, but it definitely played a significant role
Hmm.
in what became radical Islamic terrorism following
Absolutely.
the breakup of the
Absolutely.
Soviet Union and
Yeah.
9/11,
See, the
etc.
ideas of radical Islamic terror are always there, but that's for a different episode.
Yeah, that is another series in itself.
Yeah.
So this war is probably draining the last bit of economic resources that the Soviet Union could have had.
Yeah.
And there is probably a huge lack of motivation to the soldier on the ground at the time.
Yes.
We have very
Yeah.
little art and literature naturally because of the nature of communist states to read up and learn more about the communist advent into Afghanistan. There may be a couple of movies
No, no,
at
no.
the
There is a lot of literature, a lot of art, a lot of movies. Like,
except for Rambo, because I don't think of
no, no, no.
Rambo as an
Rambo is not
accurate
the most accurate.
description of the Soviet war
Yeah.
in Afghanistan.
And it's hilarious because all these people that the Americans were glorifying as freedom fighters, they ended up fighting them again in 2001. So I'm like,
Yeah,
okay.
that was a big that was a big bro moment for the United
Yeah,
States.
he's like, bro, what? Anyway, so again, like, let's come back to Soviet Union. There was a lot of bureaucracy that also hampered the economic growth in the erstwhile Soviet Union, because you had one sector, and one particular sector had almost 2,000 to 3,000 bureaucrats looking after it. You had what you can essentially call disguised unemployment of these bureaucrats, like unnecessary positions. You had one secretary, and for that secretary you had like five different secretaries, and all these people were just looking over different files, which did not lead to any type of progress when it came to bureaucracy of, say, some project being passed, say a hydroelectric project, or a or a project with respect to agriculture or trade. It was like the intensive bureaucracy was only done away at the time of perestroika, which was under Gorbachev. And perestroika literally means restructuring in Russian. And restructuring meant ki bhai, remove red tapeism, remove bureaucracy. In fact, the funniest thing is, I'll tell you how similar India and Soviet Union
I
are
was just coming to that
with
because
respect to bureaucracy.
91, if you talk about India, go on.
Exactly. Because okay, fine. Like first, you give your point, and I'll give my point after that.
No, 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 no. Finish up.
Okay, fine. So what it started happening was that in Soviet Union there was a lot of bidding that was taking place for lush bureaucratic positions, and so see an incompetent bureaucrat who had a lot of money, who had a lot of familial power in the Communist Party, would take over a very lush posting and would eventually not ensure the right type of growth that that particular sector deserved. And this happens in India till this date. Bidding for lush posts, of course, this is hearsay. We cannot corroborate it, but everyone talks about
Well, yeah, that is. I'm not going to go into the politics and
it. Yeah,
nepotism in Indian bureaucrat capitalism and
yeah,
favors and bhai bhatijawad. That
yeah.
is another episode again.
Another episode.
But
Tender, tender.
सरकारी टेंडर हड़पना
Bidding, bro.
1991
Yeah, the
1991 is when the Soviet Union breaks apart.
hmm,
1991 you come to our homeland, and 1991 isn't a particularly great time for India either. India is
yes,
having its balance of payments crisis. We are on a severe shortage of foreign exchange reserves. The Indian rupee has to be devalued to,
yes.
kind of take care of basic exports. And, we come on a very tight leash with the from the IMF. So we
Yes.
receive some grants and aid from them, but India is on a very tight leash from the IMF to kind of restructure its economy, come down and make very radical economic reformative moves.
To to make an interesting point to you, right? I'll tell you how India could have also had its Soviet Union moment back in 1991 is because back then, once the Soviets were gone, the Americans were the unipolar dominators of the world, and what that meant was that they wanted to come back to us for having a pro-Soviet Union stance. So in the American Senate, now this is a fact. I'm not making this up. The Republicans and the Democrats, both these entities said that places like Kashmir need to be given independence. The Northeast should be cut off. All the places which are striving for secessionist movements in India need to be looked into carefully. So they were trying to replicate the Soviet model in India,
Yeah,
in
I
India
mean,
as
it,
well.
it, it
Yeah.
could be argued. I mean, for the lack
Yes.
of a better word, they were trying to balkanize India in
Yes.
certain ways.
Yes.
1990s are also a very horrible time for the Indian armed forces in Kashmir. There is
Punjab, Kashmir, Northeast, everywhere.
there is an inflow of weapons from probably the Mujahideen that was used in Afghanistan,
Probably me.
traveled
Yes.
through
Yes. From the Mujahideen.
Hunza and all those
Yeah.
regions
Kashmir.
into Indian territory, Kashmir, and many Indian armed forces personnel sacrificed their lives, probably
Yes.
because of external interference. Let's not take any names, but
Probably me. It's a fact. It's because of
it
external
would be
interference.
it would make a lot of sense to argue
Hmm.
that there was external interference. There were many
Hmm.
Western powers who were threatened by the idea of India
Hmm.
existing as a strong unit. Many
Yes.
still probably are.
Yeah.
So that is not even up to debate anymore. That's probably
Yes.
not hotly contested. Most
Exactly.
people would still agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
So 1990s, difficult situation in Kashmir, balance of payments crisis. We have the NSC, NIM, ULFA, etc., in
Yeah.
the Northeast. We have radical left-wing extremism in
Central India.
parts of, yeah, central South India, Orissa, Andhra Pradesh. So,
Yeah.
it's not a great time. The government of India is weathering those storms. I think a large part of our ability to weather that storm came from the economic reforms, though. They were tightly led by the IMF, but the leadership of that time, Narasimha Rao, etc., they did a decent job
Very good job.
with
With
the
the insurgencies
restructuring.
also. With the insurgencies
And
also, and the economic restructuring, making India
yeah,
globalized.
we saw a fairly high rate of economic growth, which gave a lot of satisfaction to the aspirational Indian population.
Yeah.
So that and another way. Uh, Thanks to prudent planning and economic decision making, India was able to weather those storms. But in another way, that does show that excessive state planning and excessive accruing of resources controls to a centralized kind of planning committee is a sure shot formula for economic policy failure. We
and
have seen
disaster.
that in the Soviet Union,
Yeah,
and to a much smaller extent, we saw that in pre 1991 India as well.
India as well.
And
And
I
I
think we
think
have been able to weather that storm
yeah, and
effectively.
credit where it's due. I think this present establishment has done enough when it comes to reducing red tapeism. They've made certain amounts of changes which has ensured that a lot of foreign capital come in so that at least the integrity of the country is ensured. Because let me tell you that the moment Western world thinks that India is being a little hesitant in doing business with itself, they'll start funding all these separatist movements all over again. Unpopular opinion, but that's what I feel.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, it's not very hotly contested.
Yeah,
You can't be adversarial with a lot of Western agencies, and you can't be very good friends with them also. I think
absolutely.
the External Affairs Ministry does a decent job of kind of walking that tightrope. I think ever since post 1947 era, India has championed non-alignment, and it's always done a very excellent job of being very diplomatic and
Yeah,
tightroping there. So I think I have a lot of confidence in the Indian Foreign Service and its training and the degree
yeah,
to which it's programmed into our diplomats to not hold biases.
yeah.
So Jay, what
Hmm.
are our main takeaways from today's conversation? You can give
See,
yours and I can give mine.
the main takeaways from our today's conversation is that Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc states, even though we saw them as one entity, they cannot be considered as one entity because there were multiple ethnic groups, multiple religious identities who were forcefully stitched up together in a temporary arrangement, due to which a lot of disdain and resentment started coming for the Russians who were ruling over them. There was the rebellion in the former Czechoslovakia. There was an uprising in Hungary, and then eventually there was the Polish upheaval in the 80s. So this is one of the reasons why the Soviet Empire fell. The second reason why the Soviet Empire, I would like to call it an empire because in essentiality it was an empire. And empire comes from a word called imperium, which is a Latin word, which means that through through force and might you are able to exert control. So uh, so the Soviet Empire also fell because of centralized economy. I think Raj here is where you can take over.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
the centralized economy, the excessive control of the state over means of production,
yeah,
and the absolute
yeah,
disintegration of any kind of free market cannot sustain any nation.
yes,
I am not a free market capitalism absolutist either. I think that any kind of formal economic system will eventually
yeah,
average out to becoming a mixed economy. You
yes,
will have a certain element of free economy, businesses for functioning also, but the
yeah,
state will be correcting those market failures slightly to elevate people on the absolute margins or the lowest rungs of society.
yeah,
However, the excessive controls of the state on tools of production, means of production, by empirical evidence has largely failed. The Soviet example is in front of us.
yeah.
Even the excessive amounts of red tape in pre 1991 India was also an example of our own failure, out of which we
Also,
came.
the
So
third
these
reason
economic
I yeah,
fundamentals are failures.
yeah,
We need. So I'll just finish. Sorry to interrupt you. You can
yeah,
come in
yeah.
after this.
My apologies. Yeah,
No, 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 no. Communism and its
mm,
revolutionary ideas are written in the late 1890s, and
yeah,
by the early 1990s, they're dead. So the
yeah,
entire ideology loses its popular support within less than 100 years. To
yeah,
contrast this with Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which is the first major foundation stone of modern day economics and advocates the free market or the invisible hand, was a book written in 1776 and still has many proponents.
yeah.
It still has the basic demand curve which every economic student learns to draw in the class 11th and class 12th economics.
A
So
lot
these
of
principles are still very much alive and kicking. So
yeah,
we
a
all
lot of
know empirically
yeah,
which economic principle works and
yeah,
which doesn't. That
yeah,
is
but
much
a lot
easier.
of pro-Soviet and pro-communism experts would argue that the Soviet economy or the communist economy was never really in its organic form led to function because of so much pressure that was being put on them by these capitalistic forces on their frontiers. So I think that can be a point that we can note because there is a lot of argument which states that had the communist economy, led if it would have been led to flourish without so much of insecurity, it might have yielded different dividends, as we saw in the
My
case of a
argument against, go on, sorry.
yeah,
Sorry.
as in the case of the non-alignment member Yugoslavia, which is also a communist state, but for the longest time it had the highest HDI. It had a better HDI than a lot of Western countries. It gave people offs with like pay. So it had a lot of principles that we consider very important to a healthy economy.
Yeah, my only pushback against that would be
Hmm.
uh, proponents of communism might say that you had its frontiers being dominated by the capitalists who were trying to make incisions
Yeah,
into the functioning of the state,
yeah,
but you will always be there.
okay.
What is your idea? You will make the whole world communist. If
Yeah,
there is a
and,
strong upcoming communist
yeah,
bloc, there will be a
exactly,
counter. There will be a
exactly.
counteractive force as well. That is,
And that, yeah, I
if
agree.
not a rule of politics, that is the most human tendency out there. People
Yeah, and
will counter that
yeah,
ideology because people will be afraid of many of those ideas spreading
yeah.
into their own country.
And that brings me to the third point and one of the most important points for the fall of the Soviet Union, and that being that Soviet Union always being an internationalist, globalist idea rather than being a regional idea, due to which they tried to incorporate as many territories, subjugate as many territories as they could possibly can, but in its eventuality failed in doing so, and that's what led to its eventual collapse. Like you said,
So,
right? You will always have something which would
yeah,
try to go against you. And if you
I mean,
try
you're
to make
already always going to be there.
exactly, so yeah, that's the third point, and I think the fourth point we can say that it was the invasion of Afghanistan, which was mismanaged, not properly planned, a lot of losses of soldiers, and eventual bankruptcy of the Soviet state. That could be the fourth reason for the fall of the Soviet Union. Then also excessive dependence on Siberian oil and the energy crisis with regards to coal and the dependency on coal as well for energy requirements.
Yeah, I mean, as a modern day lesson, we can always look at that as a warning to always protect your nation's sovereign resources and always have a plan for countering energy insecurity. We forget
Yes,
as to how much of a role that plays in the overall geopolitical uh, agenda of a nation. And I
there was
think
another sorry.
no, no, no. And I think that many countries, as ideologically opposed as they might be to each other, will make many compromises to deal with them when it comes to oil, when it comes to other sources of energy. And that's why energy security is a very important aspect of statecraft, and that must never be pushed in the back of a policy priority.
And I think this is where we can conclude. There was a lot of factionalism in Soviet bureaucracy and different political units. So you would have like different groups. Some groups would be dominant, and they would always try to outsmart or outdo the other groups in order to get short-term goals, say a better bureaucratic position or a loftier post where they could get better earnings, but at the cost of the the union eventually. So factionalism amongst the political elite and bureaucracy of Soviet Union can be the sixth reason for its collapse.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we
So
can conclude there.
yeah, we can conclude it.
I think it
And
was an enlightening conversation. I hope
yeah,
our audience and our viewers and our dear friends feel the same.
yeah.
And thank you for joining in and keep
And
staying
one
tuned
more
for
thing,
more.
please like and subscribe. Half of you guys who watch our
Yeah,
videos, you're not even subscribed. It would mean a lot to us if you
yep.
subscribe and follow our content, because the two of us put in a lot of effort in these videos, and we want to spread as much knowledge as we can from a neutral perspective. So
From
we
an
are here
unbiased view.
from an unbiased view. So it would mean a lot for us that you subscribe and push the bell icon. I can't believe
So
I'm
if you
doing
see us,
that.
if you see
Yeah,
us anywhere, and if you see that even if we are adding a minute worth of value to your feed, please
yeah.
subscribe and like and share with your family and friends. It would mean
Family,
a lot
friend,
to
and
us,
like,
and we will stay motivated to keep doing this.
keep
Thank
doing
you very
this.
much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Jai Hind, Jai Mata
And
Di. Let's
Jawadi.
rock. Yes,
Let's
let's
rock.
go.
Himesh, Yami, come back. Bye. See you.
Chalo, bye.
Bye. See you.